This one might be a little bit shorter, hopefully more conversation than some of the ones before. Next week, hopefully, will be a lot of conversation, dialogue. The first week we were looking at the 4 different strands primarily that led to the UCC: congregational strand, the Christian connection, the evangelical synod, the German Reformed Church. Those 4 strands coming together to form the UCC. Also important to note that there were other strands, other groups that were in there. Some of them I might have mentioned: the Armenian Christians, some Native American Christians. There are certain other groups that are in the United States that certainly quite a few African Americans who are part of the UCC and have been for a long time. So while that 4-strand model is sort of the standard history of the church, I think it's important to lift up that there are still a multiplicity of voices from the beginning, and even more so in the last 20, 30 years. And then we talked about the merger itself and the controversy around the merger, the lawsuit that emerged, and tried to show how those discussions around the merger became crucial for the understanding of what the UCC became, and then some of the tensions that were inherent in the polity of the UCC that we'll talk about today. And then last week, talking about the church since the merger to the present day, and the evolution of the church structure during that time, and the evolution of the identity of the UCC, going from being a church that's primarily about sort of the ecumenical mission that founded the church to one that's very much about social justice and progressive Christianity today. So with that, we can dive right into today's topic, which is the fun conversation about polity, how the church is governed, where authority lies, who's in charge, all that different kind of fun stuff. That I need. There are a number of different approaches that I think I can take. I think the most important stuff to start with, well, I can start with the basics, and that's just the structure of the church, some of which I've alluded to already, but it's important to understand how the church is structured. And then after considering the structure, we'll look at sort of a sense of ecclesiology and polity that emerges out of the restructuring conversations of the 1990s, and which is sort of regnant today in the UCC. And then we'll talk about a few other things that sort of are related, and then I'd like to hear how that compares to the experience in the Methodist Church, or things you might be expecting or not, or any just questions you might have as you sort of encounter a new polity structure in the UCC. So first off, the structure of the church. The most basic structure of the church, the most basic unit of the church in the United Church of Christ, is the local congregation. And this is the emphasis on the local congregation, as you remember from the merger debates, is rooted in the fact that the Congregationalists would only join if the rights and responsibilities and privileges of the local congregation were left untouched. That was their deal breaker for the congregational churches. So that got enshrined into the UCC Constitution. And it's actually illustrative to read the section of the UCC Constitution that talks about this, because it's not subtle. Let's see here if I can. I was just looking at it shortly ago, and I should be able to find it. Here we go. So within UCC circles, this became a pretty famous clause of the UCC Constitution. I'm sure in the UMC there's certain clauses that are famous for one reason or another. This clause became famous within the UCC Constitution, and it reads like this: "The autonomy of the local church is inherent and modifiable only by its own action. Nothing in the Constitution and bylaws of the United Church of Christ shall destroy or limit the right of each local church to continue to operate in the way customary to it, nor shall be construed as giving to the General Synod or to any conference or association now or at any future time the power to abridge or impair the autonomy of any local church in the management of its own affairs, which affairs include but are not limited to the right to retain or adopt its own methods of organization, worship, and education, to retain or secure its own charter and name, to adopt its own constitution and bylaws, to formulate its own covenants and confessions of faith, to admit members in its own way and to provide for their discipline or dismissal, to call or dismiss its pastor or pastors by such procedure as it shall determine, to acquire, own, manage, and dispose of property and funds, to control its own benevolences, and to withdraw by its own decision from the United Church of Christ at any time without forfeiture of ownership or control of any real or personal property owned by it. That was the clause that the Congregationalists insisted got put into the Constitution from the get-go. And as you can tell, I love the section where they're like, there is no way you can't infringe on the local church in any way. And just in case you're curious, we're going to enumerate all the different ways you might infringe on our independence and our autonomy. So when I say the basic unit of the United Church of Christ is the local congregation, I mean that the basic unit of the United Church of Christ is the local church. And that's why in some of the conversations, I remember when Dawson Taylor preached at Bering a while ago, and I came to hear him preach, which was a great treat, and then came to the question and answer session afterwards. And some of the questions that emerged from some of the members at Bering were things like, what do we have to change? Do we have to start changing liturgy? Do we have to start changing hymnals? Do we have to start, what does this mean for implications? And, Don Longbottom, myself, and Dawson just had to keep saying, you don't have to change anything. The local church literally can do whatever it wants. There are no, there is complete autonomy of the local church that cannot be infringed in any way. So that is the most basic sort of element of the UCC, is this congregational polity that's an inheritor from the Congregationalists. So the next level up, if you will, in the United Church of Christ, they talk about settings or expressions of the church, not levels, because they don't want to imply hierarchy. This is important as you start talking about the ecclesiology of the church. So you have the national setting of the church, you have sort of the conference setting of the church, or the national expression of the church. That's sort of the language that is generally used. Again, in order to say this is non-hierarchical, because again, the most basic unit of the church is the local church. That's the top, that's the pinnacle. That's the building block of everything. So then you have associations. And the association structure is, has different derivations in the two different, denominational sort of polities that made up the UCC. On the congregational side, the concept of an association goes back to the Cambridge Platform of 1648. And what it basically entails is, how do you, in a congregational setting, authorize ministry? So that was a big thing in the 17th century. In the 17th century, how do you authorize ministry? They're coming out of a Church of England where it's easy. You authorize ministry because a bishop ordains someone. Well, if you insist that there aren't bishops and that the congregation, runs itself, how do you authorize ministers? Particularly in a denomination that in the 17th century was very concerned about issues of orthodoxy. Remember, they kicked out Roger Williams, who then went on to Rhode Island to help establish Rhode Island and the First Baptist Church in the United States. They had no they hanged Quakers. These early Congregationalists were pretty clear that doctrine and orthodoxy mattered. So if that's the case, how do you authorize ministry? And what they came up with was this, what they said, they looked at the New Testament and they said, well, in the New Testament, it is the apostles who authorize other apostles for ministry. And so they came up with this idea that it should be the association of clergy in a local area who on their own set the criteria for ordination, and they examine candidates. And then the local church, in cooperation with the association, is a place of ordaining. But it's the authority for ordination flows through the association. Now, over time, the association came to include not just the clergy who are in the area, but also the local churches. But one of the interesting hangovers of this is that in an association, each individual ordained person is a member of the association, and then congregations are members of the association. So, and that goes back to this early weird sort of congregational way of doing things. Diane, for instance, will just on her own have a vote in the association meeting, any association meeting. In addition, Bering Church, based on its size, will have a certain number of votes that are allocated to the membership. But no matter where Diane goes, as long as she's still in the association, even if she leaves Bering Church, as long as she has membership somewhere with the church somewhere in the association and her standings in the association, she can vote in any association meetings. So the association's primary task is authorization for ministry, and also disciplining people for ministry. So, and the organ that does that, you'll hear this in UCC circles, is every association has what's known as a committee on ministry. And the Committee on Ministry is by far the most important body in the association, because going back to the notion that the most important function of the association is authorization for ministry, by extension, it's not surprising that the most important committee or organization within the association is the Committee on Ministry that does just that. So the association elects members to the Committee on Ministry, and they say they serve their terms. It's a mix intentionally of both lay and ordained people, and they're responsible for examining people for ministry and then authorizing ministry. Now, coming back to this sort of weird polity of the UCC, the denomination issues what's known as the Manual on Ministry. And the first Manual on Ministry, I think, goes back to the 1970s. So there's something called the Manual on Ministry, which is there as a guide for associations to use in walking through the process of ordination and also of disciplining clergy. But here's the kicker. Technically, the association can do whatever it wants. The association in no way has to follow the Manual on Ministry, because the national setting of the church is they're just recommended guidelines. The association is autonomous. The national setting can't tell the association what to do. And so the associations, so there's this, as I explain this, you'll see why this gets to sort of one of the key concepts of the UCC in terms of polity. We get to in a moment. But so there's this interesting dynamic where associations don't have to follow the same rules as other associations. They tend to, and I don't know many associations that don't, but what it means is certain associations are stricter in terms of ordination than others. And with the new Manual on Ministry that came out just a couple of years ago, they're attempting to streamline some of these things. But when I got ordained to the Metropolitan Boston Association, which, given the history of the UCC, is fairly large. So there are 80 churches in the Metropolitan Boston Association, including a lot of very healthy churches and vibrant churches. And there are a whole bunch of seminaries in Boston as well. So the Metropolitan Boston Association, the Committee on Ministry of that association, is exceptionally busy. And after I got ordained, I was then asked to sit on the Committee on Ministry, because they wanted to have a range of folks, including people who had just gone through the process, who can reflect on that, to be on the committee. So I had the privilege of serving that committee for 3 years, one of the busiest associations, committees on ministry in the country. And Eastern Massachusetts was known as being just like one of the hardest places to get ordained. Not only because it was tough to get a meeting. When I was trying to get a meeting with the Committee on Ministry, I had to book my meetings a year in advance in order to get a slot to meet with the Committee on Ministry in Eastern Massachusetts. We ended up dividing the committee. It was a large committee into 2 groups so we could try and see more candidates, because there were so many candidates that were seeking ordination that we had to deal with. And we put up certain hoops. Like I had to jump through hoops for my ordination that other associations didn't. So when I got ordained, it was required that I had a unit of CPE, clinical pastoral education. A lot of other associations have never required CPE and do not require it now. But in order for me to get ordained in Metropolitan Boston, I had to have a unit of CPE. They also had a requirement that I had to have a social justice project. And I remember proposing a certain social justice project to them and the committee rejecting it and forcing me to do something different, which was extremely time consuming at a time when I didn't have the time to do it. But I didn't have any choice. They were like, if you're going to get ordained, this is what you have to do. But those requirements aren't present in other associations. In addition, the theological rigor of the Committee on Ministry in Metropolitan Boston was pretty intense. I mean, this was, when we went through the theological papers in Metropolitan Boston, it was not for the faint of heart. We would grill people pretty fiercely. And actually, Metropolitan Boston, before the revision of the Committee on Ministry, or the Manual on Ministry, Metropolitan Boston had its own process that it developed on its own. That was actually adopted later by other committees on ministry around the UCC, but they had their own unique process. And so candidates going through Metropolitan Boston had an entirely different experience of ordination. I remember at one point during my going through the Committee on Ministry in Metropolitan Boston, like at one point they were grilling me until I broke down in tears. I don't often break down in tears, but they literally grilled me into such a thing. And I remember being told afterwards that some people apologized for the line of questioning. It actually was revolving around my father, who was dying of cancer at the time, and they just hammered at certain things about my father and me, which was, I think that was what they wanted to do, but anyway. And I remember talking to some folks on the committee afterwards, and they said, yeah, like when I went through ordination, some other association, like I barely had to answer any questions and just went right through. I mean, they're the same, because of the same basic requirements, but the level of rigor is all depends on who's on the committee at the time. So it's one of these interesting things where you have a situation where, yeah, certain associations are just harder to get ordained in. And I'm sure that's true at other denominations. I know it's true in the Episcopal Church. I know it's true where, depending on where you are in the country, the difficulty of getting through the system is higher because of both the number of candidates and the rigor with which they examine those candidates and the way they put up different. But that's certainly true in the UCC. But again, the most recent manual of ministry was an attempt to revise that. But given the polity, each association can do whatever it wants. And especially in a small association like the Houston Association, which is not big by UCC standards. In the Houston Association, it really will matter who's on the Committee on Ministry. Because currently we have some great people on the Committee on Ministry, and we're really lucky that Leslie Jackson's the chair. I know it takes a lot of time for him, but he feels very passionate about it because he knows how important that particular committee is for the life and work of the church. He takes it very personally and he pours himself into it. And every time he thinks about stepping away from it, I'm like, no, you can't do that yet. Please don't do that. Because again, it's not a big association. It's Eastern Massachusetts. There are endless people you could cycle through. But in this association, it's a little harder. So, that's where I think it's important that if any of you are asked, for instance, at some point to serve on the Committee on Ministry, please say yes. You don't necessarily need to be an expert in UCC polity to serve on that committee. But if you're asked, it's a really, really important committee. And so and it's also a fun one to serve on. One of the things that's happening now in terms of the polity structure regarding the Committee on Ministry is a number of associations are recognizing that when it comes to disciplining clergy, they need to make sure it's more consistent across the denomination. So the new manual of ministry is an attempt to try and streamline some of the ordination process, which has been done because they recognize the problem of difference and they're trying to get the associations to be more in line with one another. The disciplining of clergy, this is tricky. So the way it works, it's called a fitness review. If you're a clergy person, these are not words you want to hear. In order to bring a fitness review against a clergy person for financial mismanagement or for violating the clergy code in any particular way, you need to have two different people submit something to the Committee on Ministry for a fitness review. So one person can't try and take down a minister, but two people can. Once a fitness review gets submitted, the committee gathers and has to gauge whether or not there is actually validity to this. So there's the sort of smell test, if you will. And if it looks like a frivolous thing, they'll just toss it out. But if it looks like there might be merit to this, and when the committee looks at it, the name is redacted because there's probably members on that committee who are in the church of the person against whom the charges are being brought. And if they decide to move forward, there's a separate committee that's formed intentionally with none of the members of that clergy person's church on that committee. And then they go through this process that keeps the names of the accusers confidential intentionally because it wants to protect them against reprisals from the clergy person who's being accused. And so there's all these layers that go on for this process. And one of the things about it is that it's been acknowledged that because this is someone's career on the line, you really want to get this one right. It could be a charge of sexual assault or impropriety. It could be a charge of other things. These are pretty serious things when they come up, these fitness reviews. And so a lot of conferences and associations, including this one, and so we'll probably see this coming up at the conference annual meeting, just to give you, if not this meeting, sometime soon, because they're in discussions, to have actually a statewide committee separate from the ordination committee just for fitness reviews. Because it also matters whether you have experience in these things. People who've gone through this process have a much different take on it than those who are brand new to it on the committee. And so as a clergy person, I think any clergy person, if they just want a fair hearing, if you've done something wrong, you've done something wrong, and you're gonna pay for it. But I think most clergy just want a fair hearing, and there's this fear among certain clergy that what if there's some people who don't like you, and they decide to bring stuff against you, and you go before the Committee on Ministry, and it's a Committee on Ministry that's not a kind one. Then what happens? So, this, so they're trying to actually have more statewide, especially in a place like Texas where the associations are smaller, a statewide fitness review committee, which somewhat violates the polity of the UCC because it's supposed to be on the association, but it's still on the association level, but it's the 4 associations of the conference combining for this one thing. It's actually not overseen by the conference, but still at the association level, if that makes any sense. So that's the association. The association, in addition to being a place where ministry questions get resolved, it's also a place for fellowship and ministry for the churches in a particular area. And I think in Houston, this is particularly significant because it's not a big association. And with Bering joining the UCC, there are a lot of options for shared ministry. And I speak for myself and also some of the people I've spoken to. We love to try and do more things in the Houston Association to raise the profile of the UCC and also just to work together because that's something that we can all benefit from. And that's one thing I look forward to. Ironically, in a place like Eastern Massachusetts, where there are 80 different churches in the association, they almost never do shared ministry together. There's this old congregation. People up in Eastern Massachusetts, they don't even show up to the association meetings. Most churches don't even show up to the association meetings because the way they see it is the association is there for clergy matters and nothing else. So there'll be a few delegates who vote. But I remember going to some of the association meetings in the Metropolitan Boston Association. They're like, where are all the people? And the reality is most people who are there are like, it's for ministry stuff. The rest of it will take care of itself. Now, in Houston, the association is actually pretty tight historically. And that's because, of course, it used to be an old E&R association. And so the association was the old presbytery. And so the old presbytery and Presbyterian polity had quite a bit of authority and power and saw itself in a very different way than a congregational association did. So here you actually have, so this is what's interesting, is the culture of associations varies. When I was in Iowa, it had a particular culture. When I was in Connecticut, Connecticut's interesting. Connecticut's association boundaries have been the same for like 250 years, 300 years. What that means is you have to be able to, ride your horse to go to the different churches in the association. So the associations are teeny. They're these very well-established churches, but they're very small associations. And you could drive across the association in 20 minutes. It's because you just have to be able to get in your horse and ride to these association meetings. But they still have the same boundaries even today. And each one of those little associations in Connecticut has its own committee on ministry. So Massachusetts has consolidated some of them. And I imagine Connecticut by now has started to consolidate them. But it was always amusing to me when I was up there being like, gosh, these associations are teeny little associations. So that's that level, the association level. And then the next level up, of course, is the conference. And the conference was, now the conference is an interesting history here. On the congregational side, the first 2 conferences were Massachusetts and Connecticut, not surprisingly. But they were established in the 1790s. And the incorporated name of the Massachusetts and Connecticut conferences was always the Connecticut Missionary Society and the Massachusetts Missionary Society. So the original purpose of the conferences in Massachusetts and Connecticut was to raise money to plant churches in upstate New York. That's why they were established. So unlike the associations, whose primary purpose historically was to authorize ministry, the conferences historically, their primary purpose was to do mission work. And that really was the focus of associations for a long time. That was different, however, in the E&R Church, where the conference level is the synod. And the synod actually has a lot more power. As the new denomination came into being, the conferences became this hybrid thing where sometimes they're more missional focused, sometimes they're more sort of church administratively focused, depending on where they are, and depending on who leads them. But I think in my mind, they ideally would be more mission focused. They're my congregational biases coming out. So in the South Central Conference, again, there are 4 associations. There's an association in New Orleans. There's the Houston Association, which is known as the Heart of Texas Association, all the central churches in Central Texas. And then there's the North Texas Association. The smallest association of the 4 is New Orleans. We're the second smallest, and the other 2 are the 2 larger associations. There are not many churches in the South Central Conference. There are fewer churches in the South Central Conference than there are in the Metropolitan Boston Association. So there are about 75 churches, 72 churches, something like that, in the entire South Central Conference. It's not big. And so it's one of the smallest conferences in the denomination. Yet it has one of the largest geographic areas. So there's some discussions that I think we'll be having in the conference about how we want to actually administer this, because we got to figure out what we're going to do. Now, conferences, this is where I think the relationship between the Methodists and the UCC might be more similar. At the conference level, the conference minister, which would be the equivalent of a bishop in the UCC, the conference minister's responsibility is primarily to help churches that are either in trouble or in pastoral transition. So most likely you'll see the conference minister in one of those two times. If you're having internal troubles or you're in pastoral transition, the conference is there to help guide that process, help out with that process. And they help out with that process in a couple of ways. One is they always sit down with the search committee, that's the local church search committee, and try and help the local church search committee train them on what they need to do, give them expectations of what they can expect. The other thing is you apply to churches through the conferences. So in the UCC, so once, so Diana, she's in, it's like she gets to, as a UCC minister, she can apply to any church around the country. There are no limitations in terms of conference as clergy. All clergy are free agents in the UCC. And when you apply directly to a church, but you do it via the conference. So what happens is there's a centralized clearinghouse for your UCC profile as a clergy person. And when you say you want it to go to, and when it gets circulated, it gets immediately sent out to all the conferences. So all the conference staff then have your profile. And when you want your profile to be sent to an individual church, it goes from the conference headquarters to the individual church. So the conference becomes the clearinghouse for UCC profiles. So what that means is the conference then takes on a big role in trying to recommend particular candidates to particular churches. So the conference is reviewing all of these profiles of candidates. And if they see one they think might be a good fit for a particular church, they'll be like, hey, Bearing Church Search Committee, here are 5 profiles that we've looked at that we think are really good for you. You should take a look at them. But again, the conference minister has no authority to interfere whatsoever with the process, but they're there to help. They're there to support. They're there to advise. So the conference also, various conferences carry on various ministries as well. Within the South Central Conference, our conference, we of course have a summer camp down called Slumber Falls down in New Braunfels, right on the Guadalupe River, or Guadalupe, however you pronounce it. And it's a beautiful little spot. I definitely, if you haven't seen it yet, go take a trip down there. Yeah, you can rent it out for retreats, for church retreats. It's fun, and yeah, it's owned wholly by the conference, and it has again typical summer camp stuff in the summertime. And then the conference also historically has, it's now a part of a different body, I'll mention it. Members of the conference also set up a retirement community down in New Braunfels called Eden Homes. Now, if you're asking yourself why New Braunfels, of all places, for a very long time, the largest church in the conference was in New Braunfels, a church called First Protestant Church. And First Protestant in the 1990s left the denomination because they thought it was too liberal, and there was a church that broke off and started a new church there. So there's a splinter of First Protestant that's in New Braunfels that's a UCC church. First Protestant itself was pulled out of the denomination. I don't know how they're doing now, but I feel a little bad because one of my predecessors at First Congregational went from First Congregational to First Protestant. He died recently, but he later on went to go preach in Unitarian churches afterwards. So I don't know what went on there, but I would have loved to have talked to him about how does a church where you're basically a Unitarian, how does church become so conservative that they leave the UCC? Like, what happened? I don't know. So there's a retirement community there. Another sort of affiliated ministry, although it's not technically a ministry of the South Central Conference, is Back Bay Mission in Biloxi, which is a long-standing mission of the old ENR Church that goes back to the early 20th century, that does great mission work in Biloxi. And it's quite common for churches to take mission trips there and do all sorts of work there. The association's organizing a mission trip sometime in November. So if there are folks from Bering who want to go to Biloxi and see Back Bay Mission, that's certainly an option. I think at a certain point, the board of Back Bay Mission decided to no longer be officially a UCC organization, but I mean, half the people on the board are UCC people, and there's still a lot of UCC connections. But not being UCC, I think, allows them to apply for a broader range of grants and things like that. Yeah, so that's another sort of thing of the conference. So you've got the conference level, different missions, ministries, but a large part of it is building connections among the clergy, supporting clergy, building connections among the churches, and also supporting churches and clergy during pastoral transition or internal difficulties. Then you have the national setting of the church. As I mentioned before, the national setting is in Cleveland. That's the headquarters. There's a cool headquarters that they built when they moved out there. So it's something the UCC built for that purpose. There's a big office building. There's a worship space, beautiful chapel. There are conference rooms at the hotel that are attached to it. So that's the national headquarters in Cleveland. And then the national, again, there are 4 different covenanted ministries, so to speak, in the national church that all have one unified board now. And so there's local church ministries that deals with all sorts of home missions work, anything you can think of, planting churches, supporting churches in various ways, coming with educational materials, all that stuff. All that jazz is under local church ministries. You have global ministries, which is a combined ministry with the Disciples of Christ that does, again, as it says, global ministries, where we partner with church organizations, nonprofits, churches around the world to do work around the world. There's Justice and Witness Ministries, which takes care of the social justice arm of the UCC. Those are the 3, I guess there are 3 covenant ministries. The last one and the most recent thing was done away with, the Office of General Ministries. And then you have all the administrative center. There's the pension board, so that has its own sort of UCC healthcare plan. Also, obviously, takes care of the pensions for the clergy. And then there's one organization that oversees all of the places like Eden Homes and any hospitals, affiliated hospitals and things. There's a national organization that helps oversee those. We do our insurance for property insurance with several other denominations, Disciples of Christ and the Presbyterian Church USA is how there's an insurance board, all the usual things. But so coming back to the pension question, you're dealing with this pension question. Now, here's the polity of the UCC for you. How does that work in the UCC? It works like a 401k. Churches contribute a certain amount of money to a clergy person's individual retirement account, and they can track what it is. When it goes up, great. When it goes down, great. When they retire, they can start withdrawing from it. That's that. It's not a defined benefits program whatsoever. It's what you put in is what you can take out. So if someone leaves the denomination, leaves whatever, there's no problem whatsoever. So you get whatever's in your account. That's it. And one of their another thing that's worth mentioning, there are 4 special offerings during the year. And one of the 4 special offerings, the offering that's taken on the 4th Sunday in Advent, is known as the Christmas offering, and that goes to the pension board to support clergy that are in need, because certain clergy have more in their pension, their 401k, than others, and so to try and equal things out and to help those who are in financial distress, there's that offering. That's one of the offerings that I always push very hard for the church, because I know a number of clergy who have worked very hard in the denomination, who have not been compensated the way they should have been. And if they have a situation where need arises, I want to make sure that the denomination steps up and does what's right. So that's sort of the basic structure. Before I move on to sort of a couple other things, are there any questions on the structure? I'm sort of rambling on a bit.
Just have one question. I don't know if you can hear
David.
me.
Yep, of course.
You said, there's certain associations that are a little more rigorous in their ordination requirements.
Well,
so,
yeah, in terms of who, it all depends who's on the committee, but yes.
So if somebody, say, got ordained in, say, the Houston area, and they wanted to go to, another one that was more rigorous in their ordination, I mean, would the association that they're be petitioning to, be considered for, be more reluctant to take somebody from, some association where the requirements weren't so severe? Or
This
is
opens
it
up an
pretty much
no.
level?
The answer to the question is no. That's not. I have not run into that. one association committee on ministry respects the decisions of other associations. So to talk a little bit more about the ordination process, because this is where some of the polity stuff is a little different. So the way that it works is you go through the process of the committee on ministry, and then the committee on ministry says, okay, you're good to go. The next step is called an ecclesiastical council. And in an old school congregational way, what that means is that the churches of the association are invited to send representatives to the ecclesiastical council. Now here they're done a little bit differently, but in Massachusetts, they're independent from the meetings of the association. They're just independently called ecclesiastical councils, and churches send representatives. And usually ecclesiastical council in the Northeast or other parts is just one candidate. And the whole thing is just you present your theology. And so when I had my ecclesiastical council, I had 45 minutes of presenting, here is the systematic theology of Jonathan Page. And then it opens for questions. And the questions are done by church. So each church gets to ask questions in order. And then once every church has had a chance to ask questions, then they can open it up to just general questions. And you get asked anything, absolutely anything under the sun, anything. I got asked every single question you could possibly imagine. It was 45 minutes of just nonstop questions. And I talked pretty quickly, so I got a lot of responses in 45 minutes. And then afterwards, they dismiss you and then they discuss among themselves. What do you think about the questions? Did you like his answer in the atonement question? I thought it was kind of weak. What do you want to do? And then they call back in and they either vote up or down. And then if you're approved for your ecclesiastical council, you're not ordained yet. You get ordained pending call. You could only get ordained once you actually have a job. And in Eastern Massachusetts, they only considered an ordainable call for generations to be a local church. And you have to be working more than full time or more than half time, and they have to pay you conference guidelines. Otherwise, you don't get ordained. So it's not just like going through the committee on ministry. You then have to have a church that hires you. So before you can get ordained. So there's this whole sense that it's not just like, oh, well, we really know Mary, and so let's just get Mary through the process kind of thing. Mary can get through the process, or Joe or whoever can get through the process. But if they can't find a congregation that wants to hire them, they're not getting ordained. Simple as that.
That's the same as the Methodist Church.
Okay, good. Yeah, so that's, and I know that there are definitely situations where I've seen people wait a very long time before they can find a call. And in some cases, the committee on ministry would have done that person a service if they had suggested a different path.
I'm a little unclear of the relationship between the ecclesiastical council, is it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the committee on ministry.
So the committee on ministry is an elected committee of the association. So when you go to the association meetings, part of the meeting is to vote on a budget. Part of the meeting is to elect different people to different positions. In the Houston Association, there's a council, which is sort of the group that kind of set the agenda for the meetings and things like that.
Oh, I'm particularly interested in ordination.
Okay, yeah. So the committee on ministry is just an elected committee of the association. Right. The ecclesiastical council is the entire association.
Okay.
So
they both interview a candidate?
So the committee on ministry takes you through all the steps. And then the final thing, it's almost like you're defending your doctoral dissertation. Your final thing is you go before the full faculty to defend your dissertation kind of thing. Well, that's the same kind of thing with this. It's like you go before all the churches in the association. So in Eastern Massachusetts, your committee on ministry is just your committee on ministry. For your ecclesiastical council, you could have anyone show up from any of those churches. And as long as they're a member in good standing in one of those churches, they can start asking questions and they can vote on you.
So it's the ecclesiastical council that makes the decision.
Mm-hmm.
And the committee on ministry sort of just shepherds the process.
Exactly.
Do they have the power to suggest that a person not continue or maybe hold off for a year?
The committee can straight up reject someone.
Okay.
In my time in Massachusetts, we only did that once. And it was incredibly painful. It was incredibly painful.
Tell me about it.
That's one of the reasons why they changed the process in Massachusetts. So they used to have this process where basically it all culminated to this final paper that you'd present before the committee. And it just wasn't, and so they revised the whole process. In Massachusetts, they did this really cool thing where rather than giving just a straight up psychological evaluation like they do here, And unfortunately, they changed the process after I went through the process. What they do is they help pay for you to have an ongoing counselor through the process, like therapist, that helps you explore. It goes through a genogram, all these different things, helps you explore your call and some of the reasons for your call and all these different things and different aspects of it. And I've known of people who've gone through that process that, you know what, I'm not seeking this for the right reasons. I really don't want to be a minister. And they voluntarily pull out of the process. And so they've set up the process in different ways with different steps in Eastern Massachusetts to help. It really has become more of a discernment process, whereas before it was more just sort of jumping through hoops and then a final yes or no at the end, which just led to certain situations where sometimes the committee is like, the person, it's not really bad enough to say no, but we didn't really do a good job forming this person up to this point. And so that's why they've changed the whole process there. But that's also a fun thing of being in a place like Eastern Massachusetts. You have so many bright people who are very engaged that you really have all these seminaries there to pull on all these different, all this. Yeah, I mean, it's just a lot. I mean, Eastern Massachusetts is just a different beast in terms of here, in terms of the UCC. But the cool thing is,
I understand what goes on with that.
But the cool thing is that associations then can share best practices.
So to be clear, the final decision on ordination is the ecclesiastical council. Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Sounds awfully high for Congregationalists. I envision cardinals.
Well, I mean, you can show up in red, David, and start asking questions.
So any member from any church. Well, that leads me to the question, how do you establish there cannot be an orthodoxy?
So this is a great question. So now in the past, in the UCC, there were heresy trials. And so one of the most famous ministers in congregational history, this guy Horace Bushnell, who was the father of American liberal theology, he wrote this book, Christian Nurture, that sort of helped change American theology. He was this big figure. And because his theology was so progressive, the other clergy in the association wanted to get him kicked out of the association. Now, that couldn't affect his standing in the local church. If his local church still wanted to keep him on, even if he lost his standing in the association, they could still keep him on. It just meant that if he tried to apply somewhere else, they'd be like, well, he's not in good standing in the association. But the local church could be like, we don't care if that person's ordained in the UCC or is standing in the association. So, but they had these trials where then the association members then voted whether they want to keep him in the association or not based on his theology. In this day and age, so when I was going through the process, you still had folks in Eastern Massachusetts, and everybody knew who they were. The people who would come, who were the more conservative folks, who would come and start. Now, so in Massachusetts, you've got Essex County, and in Essex County, you have Gordon College and Gordon Conwell Seminary, and those actually have congregational roots. So some of the churches in that area are actually pretty conservative, and it's not uncommon in those ecclesiastical councils for people to show up and ask, like old school, like, tell me about substitutionary atonement, and if you don't give a good response, I'm going to vote against you. Now, the good news is that those people can't carry the day with votes. Like, that's just not the way it works. But in Eastern, it used to be for a long time, there were always those couple folks who showed up, and they had their one question that they would ask every time, and they wanted a particular answer. And that's congregational polity. And then everyone votes, and in the end, and technically, I think you get voted on by church. So it's not just, so if someone shows up who wants to ask any questions from any church, they can. But when it comes time to vote, each congregation votes, and then each clergy person has a vote. I believe each clergy person has a vote in addition to each congregation, if you wanted to be technical about clicking votes. But almost always it's, vote by acclamation.
So I can be on this committee, and I believe in infant baptism and do not believe in the substitutionary atonement. And the person sitting next to me insists on believer baptism and, only. It's just, in the end, it's a matter of the total vote.
Yeah, and the good news is with the UCC today, I'm sure in the past this was certainly an issue, and particularly in ENR churches and ENR associations, because the ENR side was always more like, oh, is this referring to the Heidelberg Catechism and that type of thing? So I'm sure that came up in this association. I'm sure it came up in decades past. I think most people, when they go to ecclesiastical councils, and most people who sit on committees on ministry, realize the theological diversity of the congregations, and realize that their job is to make sure that you can equip someone to serve in a congregation once they find the right fit. So they're always going to be, so for instance, in the UCC, just like in the Methodist Church, some of the congregations in rural Texas, even though they're liberal for their communities, based on my estimation, they're not that liberal. But all those churches need clergy. So when people come through the process, there's no one orthodoxy, and people are comfortable. I think most people who go to these things are very comfortable with that notion and affirm that notion that we've got to supply people in all different churches. And the big thing that I have in terms of theology, especially when I sat on the committee on ministry, I mean, I was one of those theological, I read those theological papers line by line and was and my big thing was, I just want your theology to be, internally coherent. And sometimes they weren't. And I would be relentless in my questions on those. I could go into details of some of the things that people fell into in these traps, but I'm like, you have to think through these things. I don't care what your theology is. If you want to be, more conservative, fine. You probably might not, you may not find a church that wants to hire you, but that's fine. But I just want to make sure it's internally consistent. So. Now, one of the things that's really important when you think about, when people ask you, what's the sort of the core concept of the polity in the UCC? There's one word that grew out of the discussions in the 1990s, started going back to the 1980s, but really in the 1990s became the buzzword in terms of polity in the UCC. So if you want to know one word about polity in the UCC, that word is covenant. And the big thing about this is, because there's no enforcement mechanisms in the church, everything relies on this concept of covenant in order to work. And so the concept that really is one that gets talked about all the time is this whole sense of, we voluntarily covenant with other churches, and we covenant with the national setting of the church. We have a covenant with we are voluntarily in this covenant, in these covenantal relationships, not because it's not hierarchical, but we're doing it for the benefit of all and to further God's mission in the world. And so, churches, like First Congregational, there's no requirement that we give money to the denomination, but every year there are those of us in the church, including myself, who will advocate, if we have a good year financially, you'd be like, hey, let's bump that number up for OZWM. Let's bump that up. Let's do this. Let's give more money for this. In order to try, and my big things when it comes to budget time are making sure we pay our supply preachers well and giving more money to the denomination. Those are my things. When we go through our budget every year, I'm like, let's add a little more for this budget. And that's because I take that covenantal responsibility really seriously. The UCC, for all of it, I mean, the UCC is not perfect, no denomination is, but I owe the UCC a lot. And the way they've opened my eyes, the way my colleagues have helped me to grow, the way other churches have challenged me and helped me to grow, the way the process has nurtured me and helped me grow as a minister, I owe the UCC tremendously. It's kind of it's a weird sort of, at times, disorganized polity structure, but there's such heart in it, and there's such passion in it, and you have a lot of really talented people in the pews and people in the clergy. And I have just been so enriched by my relationships in the UCC. This is why I've gone to the endowment. I'm like, how much the endowment is going to use to plant other churches? I keep trying to push the endowment to be like, you got to start putting money in more into new church starts, which before I started talking about it, they've never given a grant for a new church start. I'm like, what are you talking about? We've got this great endowment. We should be supporting new church starts. Because this is covenantal responsibility that we all have, that does enrich us. And I think when churches fall out of covenant, it's sad to see. And a lot of churches, when I say fall out of covenant, most don't leave the UCC. There's just some that just become less involved. They don't put their lay members or clergy forward to sit on committees at the conference level or the association level. They don't show up to association meetings or conference meetings, and you can't force a congregation to do that. They start cutting down the amount of money they give, and they become functionally independent church. But I just think that's a sad existence for a congregation, especially for a clergy person. Being a clergy person can be so difficult. I can't imagine doing that without colleagues. I can't imagine doing that without support, and without those covenantal relationships. And so that term of covenant, and the thing that is so important, I think, in the UCC with this term is that it grows out of a deeply theological perspective that's very UCC. This whole sense of sort of a process thinking, which is process theology is big in the UCC, as is liberation theology. But this notion, rooted in this notion that in process thinking, God is constantly inviting you to be in union with God. It's not coercion in process thinking. There's this lure that Alfred North Whitehead talks about and other process thinkers talk about that lures you into a relationship with God, into deeper union with God. It's this lure that's rooted in love, that it wants us to be a better person and sort of follow God in our lives. And that same thing is like, this is what they were dealing with in the 1990s as they were talking about covenant. Just as God has an invitation to us and lures us to a place of love and connection, so do these other churches and our connections have this lure that draws us together towards a place of deep love and commitment and covenant that is rooted in what God does for us. It's fundamentally a theological concept, and it's not coercive, and it's not hierarchical. And different settings of the church have their own unique expressions and express themselves in different ways. And that's the same thing with different church members, how God moves in different ways. There is this incredible diversity that is a good thing. There's a diversity in theology, although it's not a broad diversity in theology, there's diversity in theology, diversity certainly in ethnicity and backgrounds in all different ways and all different gifts. And that's just celebrated in this covenantal sort of concept that is the root basis of the polity of the UCC. Because you can see without that covenant idea, rooted in our theology, then the polity doesn't really work. But when it's enriched by that, I think it works incredibly well because it's this passionate devotion to what the church is doing and to what God's doing in our lives and with us together in different communities and different structures. And so that's one of the things I know we're sort of, I can't believe I've been talking that much, but that's a really important concept. If there's one concept that you learn about this, it's that concept of covenant, that is at the core and the heart of UCC polity. And if you read anything on polity in the UCC, that comes up everywhere. And it also comes up as a question for ordination candidates, because there's a sense of like, what is that? Do you appreciate that concept of covenant in the UCC? Do you really understand that essential notion of our polity structure? There's a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is that, would you say that is also kind of a, you probably wouldn't use the word, but at the congregation level among members, would you say that sort of thing also applies?
Yeah, so in the congregational tradition, and so different traditions have different ways of conceiving of church membership ecclesiology. In the congregational tradition, it's always been what makes a church is the local church covenant. Mm-hmm. So you join First Congregational Church when you stand in front of the church and affirm the covenant together with all the other members. And then you sign the covenant. That's what makes you a member. It's really straightforward. Someone's like, are you a member of the church? And I'm like, well, have you affirmed the covenant standing up in public worship with all your other brothers and sisters in the congregation? If you have, then yes, remember the church. That's what makes church, that covenant. So the covenantal idea is one that's very powerful. And I still remember, here's a great story about that. The last founding member of the church, I don't know if I told the story before, I don't think I have to you guys, but the last founding member of the church to die was a guy named Bill Mckinley, and he died a few years ago. And Bill, old school New England, like very, very bright, but very like curmudgeonly, like very like brusque and forward. And Bill, in 1998, when the church voted to be open and affirming, Bill was one of the leading voices against doing that. He is adamantly opposed to becoming open and affirming. And I didn't know this until Bill told me. We were walking, and Bill in this very classic way, walking along, and Bill's like, I was really opposed to ONA. And I was like, oh okay. He's like, some of the members wanted me to leave over it. He said, but he had this thing. He said, I trusted the concept of covenant in the church. And I trusted the fact that the Holy Spirit was moving through the church and that I might not have the answers. And if the congregation wants to move forward with this, part of being in covenant with them is saying, I'm going to be open to where the Holy Spirit's moving. And he paused and he said, John, it was the most important thing the church has done in my time at First Congregational. He said, I was dead wrong. And the Holy Spirit was right. And it was covenant that kept me in the church. And he said, I'm a better person for it. And I shared that story at his funeral too, because I was like, it was one of these moments that was just like totally random too. We were just like leaving church, and he like turns to me and openly gay minister. I was totally opposed to going open and affirming. It's like, oh, okay, thank you for telling me. But covenant makes a difference. Now, there are a couple brief things I want to say, just because there's some documents that might be good to look at in the future, and some things that are worthwhile considering. The first is one of the things you sometimes hear is the so-called 5 marks of the UCC. And what these are resolutions that have been passed at General Synod that, as the UCC was sort of coming up with identity things at the 50th anniversary, rose to the top. And so these 5 marks of the UCC are one, that it's a united and uniting church. That we're fundamentally at our core identity, we are about ecumenical relationships. We are about building bridges. And we are a church that has come together from a lot of different places to form what we are currently. So that's the first mark of the church. The second mark of the church is that we're an open and affirming church. And again, that goes back to 1985 when the General Synod passed that resolution. Also in 1985, they passed a resolution they called the church to be a just peace church. And what that means is, it goes back to this notion, you can't have peace without justice. You could have nonviolent, you could have not open conflict without, but like if you don't have justice, you don't have true peace. So part of advocating for peace is being able to actively advocate for justice. And this, you see this, I mean, in my opinion, I know I don't want to get into hot button issues, but in Israel-Palestine right now, you don't actually have a just situation. It's kind of hard to have peace. Just peace church. The next thing is, in 1993, the General Synod passed the resolution calling on the church to be multicultural and multiracial, saying that if we want to be the true united church, we have to be a better reflection of the nation at large. And the nation at large is diverse. The nation at large has all different people in it. So we can't really be the true church unless we strive to reflect the communities in which we are and the nation that we inhabit. That God is calling us to do this. And part of that means, sort of admitting our faults and our sort of role in various racist policies that are ongoing in the United States. That's part and parcel of that. But the national setting is like, this is an aspiration to be multicultural, multiracial. And the 5th mark is to be accessible to all. I think it was the 99 General Synod that passed that. And again, that's just calling on all churches to be like, how are you putting up boundaries to others by your lack of accessibility? There's obvious ones, such as mobility issues that people have, or providing large print bulletins, or the people who might have difficulties reading or hearing, or all sorts of things. There are different ways in which people can be accessible, but they sort of call on churches to be like, the denomination needs to be accessible to all and all levels of ability. Those are the 5 marks that sometimes people will talk about in the church. And they come from the General Synod. And again, it's not coercive, but it's saying this is who we are. We're a church that strives to live into these ideals. A couple documents that are kind of cool to read. Just a couple. One, there's a UCC brochure out there that's one on UCC identity that they sell from United Church Press, which is a great summary of some of the key tenets of some of the stuff we've been talking about. And I was just looking it over and I was like, this is really useful. It's something that everyone in this class really should have. You can order them online. It's a little more theological than most of the stuff you can order from United Church Press, but it's this thing on UCC identity, and it's really good. It's a great summary of UCC identity, and it's something that I think everyone at Bearing should just have and read. I think Lynette put together a version of it for you guys at some point that was sort of based on that, but it's a great document. And then in the early 1990s, they had this, when they were going through some of this introspection, they came out with some statements on ecclesiology, and there's this whole sense of the missio Dei as being a central concept of the ecclesiology of the UCC. And it's a very short document, and it can be worthwhile to read through. I guess the final concept that you'll hear, and then we really are out of time, is, and perhaps you hear this in the Methodist Church as well, but in the congregational tradition is very big, saying that Jesus Christ is the head of the church, and that's sort of the basis of our union. Why we come together is because Jesus Christ is the head of the church. And this notion that the witness of Jesus, the living witness of Jesus, as the Holy Spirit works through us, is, Jesus is, that's the whole thing. It's like there's no hierarchy because Jesus Christ is the head of the church. And how do we fundamentally, if people are having disagreements, it's like, listen, you're not the head of the church, Jesus is. Can this bring us together? Can we find our unity in Christ, even though we might have differences? So that's something that you hear a lot as well. At least you used to hear it a lot more than you do now, but it's still sort of a core tenet in the polity structure. that Jesus Christ is the head of the church.
Yeah.
Any other last minute questions or anything, David?
Yeah, just one thing. I was Googling somewhere and I said, does the UCC proselytize? You know, is it a proselytizing church? And basically some of the stuff I found, it wasn't clear from the stuff I found whether it is or not, or most of it seemed to indicate that it's not.
Well, David,
So
I do have to ask you if you've committed yourself to Christ or not, because if you haven't, then we can
yeah, but
walk
what
down the
I'm,
aisle just as you are. You know, we can play that in the background.
yeah,
No, it's fine.
no,
It's just
I'm
me trying
not-
to make a joke. Sorry, probably didn't go too well. So, I mean, are we a church that wants to proselytize? Of course, we're spreading our message. I get up and try to spread the message all the time. This is a gospel of inclusion and love. God wants to bring healing. God wants to be in you in community, a community with others. God wants us to gather together and worship. God wants us to be disciples of Jesus. 100%. I'm going to get up and talk about that from the rooftops. I think that the history of the church is that sometimes folks have not been as comfortable doing that because they feel like it makes them too evangelical in the sort of present day meaning of the term. But I mean, that's nonsense. Like, we've got a great message. I want to get that message out there. I think everyone should hear it. You know, no, that's not, I mean, I'm someone who's a universalist. I mean, if hell exists, it's empty. I do believe that mercy does trump judgment in God's eyes, really, in the end. And I know it's not an easy belief to believe, but I still believe it, and I believe it wholeheartedly. So I'm not going to say if you're not in UCC, you're going to hell or anything like that. But I'm saying, come join the church. Come find a life in God. Your life will be enriched for it. I know God is calling us to do this. So I mean, I will certainly proselytize if that's what but that's what I mean by proselytizing. I'm certainly not going to, say, oh, you'll go to hell if you don't come to church. But yeah, we have to. I mean, we are in a moment, and we'll talk about this next week. We are in a moment where, we got a word to we have a word to preach, and it's time to get out there and preach it, because the world needs that message. And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I thought sort of a fatalism about the future of the church. I'm very optimistic about the future of the church, particularly in Houston. There's a need for a message that Bering has. It is a crying need for that message. And same thing with FCC and all that. Like, onward.
Amen.
There we go. Great. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Next week's our last class. If you have any questions in advance, think of those questions, because next week we'll be talking about the future, and so we'll be brainstorming about the future of the UCC. I thought we'd have more time for discussion. I guess there's more to say about polity than I realized.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Take care.